I want to welcome all of you to this Strudel Media Live photo talk and book release event. This is part of our series called What Moves You, and I'm really happy to welcome Fred Ritchin and Brian Palmer to our talk today. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about Fred's brand new book, The Synthetic Eye, Photography Transformed in the Age of AI, which Fred will discuss today. We started the Photo Talk series in 2020 to help people in need of food. I want to thank you for your donation, and we raised over $800 today, actually. So that's really exciting. And when I started to plan this event together with Fred, I mentioned to him that we have been doing these talks to raise money for the Migrant Kitchen Initiative. He got really excited about this idea, and so he wanted to make his talk part of that as well. And so, Fred, I want to thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I'm Anja Hitzenberger from StrudelmediaLive, and we offer live online photography classes. We give out a lot of different scholarships so that people can study with us from around the world, so that they can take classes with us. We host Stefan Frank's photo book show, which is a really great series that I highly recommend to you. We also have a YouTube channel where you can see past talks. And check out our website for our upcoming classes. But now I want to introduce our speakers. So Brian Palmer will be in conversation with Fred today. And Brian is a visual journalist, writer, and artist based in Richmond, Virginia, excuse me. His work has appeared in many major publications, including the New York Times and also on PBS and BBC. Brian's current exhibition called Homegrown at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, together with Susan Warsham, features more than a decade worth of photographs from his time in the American South. And this exhibition will be on until April 27. Brian has taught at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, Baruch College, Hampton University, and also the School of Visual Arts, where he is a member of the board of directors. And he has also received many awards, residencies, and grants. Thank you, Brian, again for being the moderator today. And Fred Ritchin is a writer, educator, and photography critic. And he's one of the world's leading authorities in the ethical issues within digital image making. He's currently the Dean Emeritus at the School of the International Center of Photography. And he was also the founding director of the Documentary Photography and Photojournalism program at the school at ICP. He was a professor of photography and imaging at New York University Tisch School of the Arts, and a co-director of the NYU Magnum Foundation Photography and Human Rights Educational Program. He has worked as the picture editor of New York Times Magazine. And I also want to mention Fred's previous publications. He wrote a book called Bending the Frame and also After Photography. Please feel free to put questions into the chat. You can also unmute during the Q&A. If you could please keep your camera on when you ask questions directly so that the speakers can see you. Otherwise, they talk to a dark wall, which we don't want. The talk will be about 75 minutes long or so. Yeah, so I want to thank Fred and Brian for being here today. And Fred, you can now share your screen or start your presentation.
Okay. No, thank you to Anya, especially for an enormous job publicizing this. And I see people here from many countries around the world, and I think that's a great thing. What I'm trying to do today really is talk about the emergence of AI on photography, where we've been, particularly with the goal of how to use photography or image making at this point in a way that's helpful in the world. You know, lots of things, as we know, are going on. Media is quite diminished in its ability to resist. And a large part of the talk, and Brian and I are in accord on this, is how to use image making to do something better in the world. First of all, knowing what's going on. So I'll share my screen. Some of these images are a little bit sensitive. I've made them with AI. And I'm doing it really just to show what's possible. I'm kind of the canary in the coal mine, you know, giving text prompts and seeing what will happen. So I think it's a good thing if these images are not shared beyond us, because some of them are somewhat incendiary. Okay, so I'm sharing the screen.
And as Fred shares, we're aiming to, he's aiming to present for about 20 or so minutes, and then if all goes to plan, we'll stop and have a quick conversation about some of the images some of the issues he raises, and then we'll move on from there.
And you guys can see my screen, yes?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so exiting the photographic universe, you know, many of the images are, as I said, are AI. The way you do it is with a text prompt. You know, you write a few words and you use different systems. This one was Abraham Lincoln taking a selfie. And many of the text prompts that I write are simply to see what the machine will come up with, if it will resist me, if there's certain words it will not allow me to use to make images or not, and so on. So I just want to start with conventional photojournalism, visual journalism. This was the front page of the New York Times, as we know. If you look at the headline, it says Trump is safe after the assassination attempt. And the argument then was that in doing this image, putting it on the front page, it was in many ways a kind of propaganda for Trump. It was a sense like in worldwide wrestling that you emerge victorious from your situation. It's the headline says he's safe. It doesn't say anything about triumphant. This is the image I would have picked for the front page of the New York Times. The sense that he's vulnerable, the sense that there's a weakness, the sense that he's old, the sense that he's afraid, the sense that he has to be held up. I would not have gone for the image that was chosen. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that one cannot simply blame a technology, you know, and that's the source of all our problems. I think the way we use the various technologies, the various strategies, have to be reflected upon as well. So I'm beginning with a quote that's very well known from Ron Suskind, who wrote in the New York Times Magazine in 2004, that he's basically the aide to George Bush was saying that there are those in the reality-based community, the journalists, and he's denigrating them as those who base their judgment on facts. He said that guys like me are in the reality-based community believing that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. But that's not the way the world really works. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. The government, the US government, this is 20 years ago. And while you're studying that reality, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will work out, where history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. And to me, this is a really important pronouncement by the government that what photography does, as an example, one of the media, is a link to the real, a link to what's actually going on. That's what we thought about photography. It's a recording of the visible. It's at a certain fractional second, that's what appearance was. It's not truth. It's always subjective, it's always interpretive, but it's been a recording and it's brought reality into the conversation. Now it doesn't matter, is the argument here. So that we have Trump, when he was his mugshot, when he was in the courtroom, he's using it as his official portrait. In other words, that the subjects of media, the subjects of imagery, know how to use imagery often better than the people making the pictures themselves or editing and presenting the pictures. That Melania in the previous administration looked like this, and now she looks like this. Throughout the world, we're finding that people are very media savvy to imagery. They know how to use them as the people being depicted. It's not the photographer who has necessarily the upper hand in interpreting things. Much of it is being legislated down, as the George Bush aide quote says, we're the empire now, and you're simply recording what we're doing. It doesn't really matter to us. So then we come to Gaza 2025, what's next? The AI video that Trump co-opted and put on his social media. And to me, there's a progression there. Reality doesn't matter anymore. We're in power, we're the empire, do what you want, we will dictate the terms. Now, AI does things that photography doesn't do. It can depict the future. Photography is always photographing the present to be seen as the past. But AI can do the distant past. It could do the far away. It could do the invisible. It could do the future. And it could dictate it, in this case, as a form of menace, as a form of threat, as an exercise of power. No matter how realistic it looks, it's still effective in getting governments to move, public opinion to be swayed. And I think that's one of the things that's coming in with AI as a tool of those in power. But it's also being used within our own community of photojournalists, photographers, artists, and so on. This is Philip Toledano's new book, We Are at War, which is taking the Robert Capa famous D-Day photographs, the invasion at Normandy, most of which were melted in the darkroom. And he's envisioning what they might have looked like with AI. So these are artificial intelligence images made by Philip Toledano, filling in the blanks of what the other images on the film that was melted might have looked at. Obviously, this raises all kinds of issues, ethical issues. Does he have a right to do that? You know, right now, in terms of copyright issues, it's much more fluid. But what does it mean that we can rewrite history? His argument is there may be no visual truth anymore. We may have to be looking at other means, other media, to confirm what's going on. It may be the end of the era of visual truth here. And then we have a Magnum photographer, Carl de Keyser, a member of Magnum for several decades, who couldn't go to Russia for reasons, technical reasons. I think it was a visa reason. And instead, what he did was he used AI to do a book, Putin's Dream, on Russia Today. This was published in December, self-published. He previously published his own book, Homo Sovieticus, when he did go, but this is published with all AI. In both cases, Toledano and de Keyser, they're very explicit this is made with AI, but at the same time, they're doing it. They're creating a kind of sense of this is what Russia might look like. The argument, of course, is anybody could do that to anybody at this point. You know, somebody anywhere in the world could make New York City look like whatever they want it to look like. It could be very menacing, it could be very happy, it could be anything you want. You don't have to go there anymore. to do what you're doing. So the argument is basically we've gone from optical photography of the 20th century, recording the visible on film, the light coming through the lens. And then we went to computational photography, which is the algorithms in the camera changing, whether we want it or not, what the image turns into, enhancing, modifying it, and so on, as well as the software and post-production like Photoshop. And now we've gone, that was a subversion of the lens, distorting what the lens is bringing us. And now with AI, we don't even need a camera. We've gone from a camera with lens to a distortion of the lens to the fact that we don't even need a camera. We could stay at home and depict the world any way we want. You know, Michael Christopher Brown did it recently with Cuban refugees, and so on and so forth. So within our own community, people are using AI in these different ways. The way Magnum dealt with this was to say, look, Carl is a member of Magnum. He could do what he wants, but we're not putting any of his images in our archive. To put it in Magnum archive, you have to have a photographer, the camera who's present. That's a stopgap measure in the early days here. We know it started with 1982, which is now, you know, over 40 years ago, when the horizontal photograph of the pyramids of Giza was made into a vertical. And when I interviewed in 84, the editor-in-chief of Geographic, he said it's really nothing. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a few feet to one side to get a different point of view. I hung up the phone, I called him back. He said, yes, that's what I said. He had said. And to me, that's really the beginning of what we're talking about. You could go back in time, you can move the photographer, and this was already in 1982. So we've had a long time to get used to the sense that we are no longer, photography is a recording of the visible in multiple ways. And I wrote a piece about it in 1984. And in the piece, this is what I wrote in 1984. In the not too distant future, realistic looking images will probably have to be labeled like words as either fiction or nonfiction, because it may be impossible to tell them apart. We may have to rely on the image maker and not the image to tell us into which category certain pictures fall. So I thought mistakenly, by saying this in 1984, that 41 years later, we would have dealt with this. We would have established rules, parameters. There would have been certain obligations on the part of editors, photographers, and so on, to be very clear, transparent in what kind of an image it was. But that was not the case. It didn't happen. I thought of it, in fact, as like the beginning of the automobile when it was invented. If somebody early on had said we needed seatbelts and red lights and green lights and so on, a lot of people would not have been killed. Recently, the chief economist of Microsoft compared AI to the beginning of the automobile, and he said it's just like the beginning of the automobile. We do have to wait for a bunch of people to be killed before we do anything about putting in kinds of regulations. So we seem not to have learned very much from it. 1989, the Liberation Army did not fire even once at the crowd of people with the Chinese government. The photographs said they did, and the photographs won. The photographs said it was a lie. The Daily News elsewhere said, yes, there was a massacre. The government was not able to overrule the evidence of photographs. That is no longer the case. In Gaza, in Ukraine, and elsewhere, more and more governments are able to just call it fake news. And since the credibility of the photograph and other media have been so denigrated over the years, you know, digitally and in multiple ways, we're having a very hard time of using photographs as evidence to show, yes, there was a massacre. Yes, somebody has to be penalized for it, and so on. So this was, you know, as we know, Tiananmen Square. And this recently was #1 on a Google search image. When people put in Tank Man, this is what you got, a guy making a selfie. We know, first of all, there were no selfies in 1989. We also know that the Tank Man was anonymous. Still, nobody knows who he was. His heroism was in large part because of that anonymity. But when you put it into Google search, it was #1. And search engines are now announcing that they are able now to fabricate images. They don't have to find them for you anymore, meaning that history is malleable. Contemporary events are malleable. The photograph itself is not seen as evidentiary that has to be respected. In fact, Google recently said that if you have photographs of long ago, but your memory thinks of it differently, just change the photograph. Your memory is more important than what the photograph says, was what somebody, a high up person at Google, said about 2 months ago. In 1994, I led a campaign, not a lens icon. It would have been like a copyright symbol where you would have been able to put this under a photograph if it was heavily manipulated. You'd be able to click on it and find out how. That was an attempt to try to, differentiate between a manipulated image and a conventional photograph. It did not go very far. Picture editors felt that it was not necessary, but this would have been perhaps helpful almost, some 30 years ago. So this recently was a protest against the security forces in Bogota, Colombia, that Amnesty International distributed, and the image turned out to be AI. Their argument was that by being AI, the people in the image cannot be arrested. They don't exist. The other interpretation is, since they don't exist, why do you want to do anything about it? So they soon took it down under criticism. But right now we have Robert Capa being modified. We have a Magnum photographer modifying. We have Amnesty International using AI as well. So these are important institutions and people beginning to experiment with AI. And at this point, we have very, very few rules and ethical obligations as to what you're supposed to do or not do. In a similar instance, this is a museum at Auschwitz, the concentration camp. They decided that black and white photographs of the prisoners was not sufficient. So they hired an artist from Brazil to colorize the images of the prisoners. They thought this would be more user-friendly for visitors to Auschwitz. Black and white was not sufficient. Of course, you don't know the color of what people were wearing, but this is, again, we have Auschwitz, we have Amnesty International, Magnum, and so on, deciding that the photograph itself, the evidence of it, is insufficient. And here we have something I consider even worse. This was the famous imagery of the people in Cambodia before they were executed. And there was an Irish artist who decided that not only would he colorize them, but who would make them smile before their execution. Due to a big protest from the Cambodian government, Vice magazine took down these images. But again, these are tendencies right now in the field to disregard the reality of situations and override it. So I tried myself just to see what would happen. I asked for a text prompt of the Victory Parade in Berlin in 1945, when the Nazis won the war. And this is what I got, which is, to me, one of the most terrifying images I've produced. The AI had no problem in having the Nazis win the war. The only thing was they asked me not to use the word Nazi. I switched it to fascist, and this is what it produced. And then I asked for an overweight concentration camp prisoner. It had no problem making it. These are readily available AI systems. You could be 14 years old and ask for the same things that I'm asking for. There's no guardrails. If I put in, let's say, nudity, sometimes they'll stop me. If I put in a bikini, they'll stop me, but then I put in swimwear and it's no problem. But the ability to rewrite history in these ways, each one of these images probably takes me about 40 seconds to make. The soldier in the Vietnam War taking a selfie, this is the back cover of my book, it has no problem. So if you're studying social studies or history, you're in high school, and you do a search, you can end up images like this, and you may not know there were no cell phones in the 1960s and 70s. And this is what he came up with, no problem. This is the ticker tape parade when the US at the end of the Vietnam War, celebrating the soldiers coming back. To me, this is front page daily news. In fact, as we know, this never happened. Soldiers coming back would go to bus stations, take off their uniforms, otherwise people would spit in their faces and call them baby killers. But I am so easily able to rewrite history this way. And again, I could put these online, I could flood the web with images like this. And one of the problems is that AI images are often found to be, especially portraits, are found to be more convincing in studies and surveys. And sometimes you can make AI images and just say, look, America should have won the war. Let's just run the image. Ron DeSantis is right, kind of thing. This is what we used to look at. This used to be a reference point. After this photograph was published in 1972, in 1973, there were no US troops left in the Vietnam. And it was able to be put on the front page, even with the nudity. You are able to use it to provoke a public discussion and governmental change. Richard Nixon at that time was president, and he had discussion with Haldeman saying, maybe we could call this, whatever they called it, the equivalent of fake news. And Haldeman's response was, no, you can't. This is a photograph. You can't get away with that. Westmoreland, who was a general at the time, wanted to call this a hibachi accident. He couldn't get away with it. This is the power that photography has had, whether it's Emmett Till on the upper left, who was beaten and lynched and kickstarted the civil rights movement in the US. Bottom left, the 1963 Malcolm Brown photograph of a Buddhist monk burning himself to death in protest of the Vietnam War. The upper right, Hector Peterson being shot 1976 in South Africa, which Nelson Mandela responded to by saying that enough is enough, we have to end apartheid. The Aylan Kurdi in the middle, which thousands of refugees were allowed into governments. The Earthrise on the right, which kickstarted the environmental movement in 1968. All these images have changed the world for the better, all these photographs. And concern here is that we are giving up the ability to provoke these discussions and to move society forward by undermining photographic credibility. So this is an AI-generated photo. By the way, AI-generated photo, there's no such thing. AI-generated image. There are no photos generated by AI. There's no camera involved. But this is what Adobe is selling on stock. This is what publications are using. This person does not exist. Simultaneously, Adobe is head of the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is supposed to authenticate content cryptographically by being able to click through an image and see if it's been changed in Photoshop. But what they're doing simultaneously, Adobe, the same company, is selling the concept of nonviolent direct action in Ukraine generated with AI, or an image of a street protest capturing authentic emotions and expressions of individuals advocating for social change with AI. This is the same company leading the quest for content authenticity is selling these images. And the community, the photojournalistic community, is not protesting. There's been no organized protest saying, how do you do this simultaneously? It's kind of like Exxon greenwashing. You can't do this kind of stuff. You have to do more to preserve the credibility of the image. So Samsung recently argued there's no such thing as a real picture anymore because images are now computational. They're changed so much algorithmically. And Adobe, the same company, argues that AI is the new digital camera. We don't need a camera anymore. So they're bringing you content authenticity and arguing that AI is the new digital camera. And to me, what I find incredibly dismaying is how little the visual journalistic community is doing anything and manifesting any response to all of this. So just a few more images, I'll stop and we'll have a conversation and then go on again. I just wanted to test with AI. This is the exact text prompt that I wrote. Would this do it for me? There were no cameras in 1815 photography. There were no cars then. It had no problem doing this. This was 2 or 3 years ago. A photograph of two friendly white plantation owners in Mississippi, 1855. For several weeks, I was having trouble getting any white plantation owners or slave owners. It was making only African American, only Black men and women as slave owners and plantation owners, which is similar to what Gemini did, the Google AI. When it was Nazis, they were making them people of color and women, in part, one suspects, because the algorithm has been written so that it's not always white people being depicted. But this is the kind of thing I was getting. When I asked for happy slaves, it was making images of happy slaves. I did not want it to make images of happy slaves, but it was making them for me. So again, it's rewriting history. In, I think 2% of plantation owners were Black, but the slave owners, plantation owners were white overwhelmingly. So I tried with Kamala Harris, the March on Washington in 1963, to see what it would do. And there she is. When I tried Kamala Harris, it made all the participants Black. When I tried Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, who were also there, it made all the participants white. When I tried Elvis Presley, who was not there, the crowd was mixed. Of course, Kamala Harris was born the year after the March on Washington, but that's not a problem for AI systems. So again, these are things you could do. I could make hundreds of these images in one afternoon, and they're basically free to make. So a photograph of the perfect family, this is what I got, which I was very happy with. It was showing me something that I did not expect. Or when I asked for the greatest mothers in the world, this is what I got. It made me very happy. I understood how human-centered I was and how wrong I was. So that sometimes AI sees things, envisions things that I would not have thought of in a more constructive way. An ethical photograph of a homeless person by a homeless photographer. What I take away from this is the guy is smiling, is a human being. He's not stereotyped as a victim. The most beautiful woman in the world. This is certainly not what, a Vogue magazine or a fashion magazine would show. I was impressed by the AI. Again, this was several years ago. Recently, I'm finding the AI is becoming more conventional and less idiosyncratic. Vogue's first AI cover, now there are fashion outfits that don't use photographers, models, or makeup people, but they do it all AI. One of the big fashion companies, in fact, argued about a year ago that by using AI, they could be more diverse because they couldn't afford models, makeup people, and photographers to show a diversity of people, but with AI, they can. So you get diversity when the people do not exist, but when the people do exist, it's hard to be diverse. And then, of course, we have deep fakes. This is the one part of AI imaging that does attract attention. Taylor Swift, lots of celebrities, they've been put in pornographic movies. It's almost exclusively women, who are being violated this way. It's also kids in schools with Nudify apps. 12-year-old boys are putting their classmates, the girls, taking their face on the AI in seconds, makes a nude body. This is the one part of AI imaging that governments seem to pay attention to some extent, even though it's insufficient. There's certain softwares like these, Nightshade is one of them, which is a longer discussion, or Glaze, which are attempts to create software that will then, if AI scrapes the image, scans it, uses it online without permission, which obviously is being done all the time, it then distorts the AI. It messes up the system. There are movements of that sort of response. So I'm just going to finish with a few images I made and then stop. Pictorial's photograph of two Martians was my prompt. I'm using AI now mostly to envision what photography cannot do. We have no photographers on Mars. So I'm trying to see what AI, how it would envision it. In this case, a very surrealistic way, but I'm looking for kind of the AI imagination. A photograph of an unhappy bot. These are the repetitive automated software that are in our computers. I figured you ask a computer about software, it may have an insight that I don't have. So this is an example of that. Or a pictorialist photograph of what one first sees after one's own death. For me, I find this a very reassuring image. The idea that we're all organic, we all decay, we die. That's the way the earth is. I thought that there was an insight that the AI had. So I'm using these AI at this point to try to see things beyond photography, the ancient world, the future, and so on, in a speculative way, with the idea that AI is a conceptual medium. Photography is more a perceptual medium. It's also conceptual, but AI is much more idea-based instead of being perceptual. So this is where I'm going to stop for a moment, and Brian and I can talk, and then we'll come back to 3 ideas for how we can help ensure photographic credibility with all this going on. So I know I spoke quickly, there's a lot of information, but I also find talking direct tangles very difficult, and it's hard to gauge things. We have a short time. My book has, much more in depth about all this stuff, but this is meant as a broad introduction, if that makes sense.
And
Brian, does that make sense?
well, it makes a lot of sense, Fred. It's a heck of an introduction. When I saw an earlier version of Fred's presentation 2 years ago, I was sort of blown away and terrified because I'd been making photographs the way I do. And what's fundamental to that process is I'm in the world. I'm in the brick and mortar, flesh and blood world. And that's something AI cannot do. I cannot, and I see some of the names of people who I respect and who've inspired me, and I can't imagine them having, and I'll say it, having less respect for the subject, meaning that I would not pretend to depict, say, African-American life in the 19th century with a computer because I have too much respect for the people that I would be trying to represent. That to me, that level of fidelity is essential. That level of connection to reality, however suppressed, repressed, whatever. Fred said something to me probably about 19 years ago after I had gotten back from my 3rd trip to Iraq. And my pictures weren't selling. That happens, I know. But Fred said something to me about, he said that in his work, he tries to be useful. That useful to the people in the images. And I want you to talk about that, Fred. What is the use of the real world images that we create? And what is the use potentially, not the conceptual, but the perceptual AI images? Like, how do we put those up against one another?
Well, look, this is the 4th book I've done on the future of digital imaging starting in 1990. And every time I do it, it's basically, to try to just chart out, how image making is changing, and how we have to be more critical, we have to be more innovative, and we cannot depend on the way it worked in the 20th century. The last iconic photograph to me that internationally provoked change in a positive way is 10 years ago already, which is Aylan Kurdi, the 2-year-old boy washed up on the beach in Turkey when members of his family, including himself, drowned trying to escape Syria. So when you're going to Ukraine or Gaza and trying to make as many people do, an iconic photograph to stop the war, to make things better, that's something that has to be certainly supported and affirmed. But simultaneously, it's not happening. We don't have a front page of a newspaper now, a front page of a magazine the way that we used to. Nobody's going to stare at it for a week and the cover of Time magazine and say, oh, there's a 9-year-old girl burning from napalm. What are we going to do about the war? It doesn't work that way on Instagram or somewhere where you just look at an image for a second. It's obscene to put some of those images in a place where you could just discard it in a second. So what I'm trying to do is argue that there have to be innovative ways, different ways of doing things to get the public's attention, to provoke change. For example, with the thousands of federal workers at this point, and I'll show some images in a minute, why don't we see their faces? Why don't we know what's happening to their families? Why don't communities put their faces on billboards if we can't do it on the front page of a newspaper? Why is our Instagram or whatever social media not flooded with those images and the impact? Why are we allowing, the people in power to dictate the imagery that we look at? That shouldn't be happening. The only images I see are Tesla cars being destroyed and people holding signs. That's it. That's insufficient in terms of this community responding. So we have to think other ways. And the reason I do what I do is to say that some of the old ways don't work anymore and we need new ways. And, the Bending the Frame book I wrote 12 years ago was really, what are the new ways and different ways of doing it? So, we need like you guys to talk to each other and say, what can we do better? How do we, as organizations, do something? Brian wrote a letter to Adobe, to the tech companies asking for, I guess you'd call it a way-back camera, where you could actually just release the shutter and you get just a recording of the visible. They don't do anything to it algorithmically. We just go back to the recording of the visible. And, has really gotten no response. But I think those letters have to come from every institution in terms of preserving the credibility of the photographic image. So I'm all for photography. I'm all for making the world a better place. I think AI can help. For example, AI can be a great search mechanism. I want the credible images of Ukraine. I want the credible images of Gaza, or whatever it would be. There's all kinds of ways of using it. But we cannot be, as McLuhan said, we can't be going 90 miles an hour looking in the rear view mirror. We can't be assuming photography does what it did last century. It does not do it anymore. Locally, it may do it, but certainly not nationally and internationally.
And I think locally may be the place to start, Fred, because it's so much easier to destroy a community than to create one, even this photographic community. People are, the examples that you showed of so-called documentary photographers making the photo illustrations that they do and pretending to represent them as something that happens in the world, that's what I resist. So while you experiment with AI, I've rewritten my code of ethics to say that I won't. I can't do that because, again, I'll go back to that original point. I have a responsibility to the subject, to the people in my image. Our histories have been manipulated, misrepresented for so long that I can't make stuff up. I think that's deeply irresponsible. People can do what they do. So given that it's so easy to destroy a community with money, with whatever, a photo community, to dilute our ethics, how do we create this community? I see all these wonderful people on the screen. How do we come together, Fred? We created Writing with Light, which you'll talk about, but we need people who are committed to this idea that we exist in the world for a reason. And folks have already said to me, well, you know, your camera, your digital camera has algorithms and so on and so forth, and Photoshop does this and that. It's like, but I still approach my job as connecting with other people and interacting with them in the world and maintaining a fidelity to them in the scene.
James Baldwin said something, the purpose of art is to reveal the questions that are concealed by the answers. So I think he's absolutely right. I think we have the answers. Photography does X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't. There are questions underneath, like how do we preserve it? You know, Stephen Mays, I see you in a rectangle. 10 years ago, he wrote an extraordinarily important piece for Time magazine about how photography as we've known it is finished. It's something else. Marvin Heiferman is here, who has one of the most influential blogs out there on social media, Why We Look. You know, Scott is here, who runs the Eugene Smith Fund. I'm just looking at one screen. I really think we have to talk to each other. I don't think this is a question, there's one answer. I think there's multiple answers. But I think simultaneously, you know, tech companies are making billions and billions of dollars, really distorting the image. So it doesn't do anything except in a consumer entitlement way. You know, like Adobe says, if you dream it, we can make it for you. Google says, you know, if your memory contradicts the photograph, just overwrite the photograph. You know, there's no sense that history or the impact on human beings, like I always thought of photography, Kushner, Doctors Without Borders, one of the founders said, without a photograph, there's no massacre. They couldn't prove it. So people get massacred and nobody knows about it. Nobody cares about it. And I think it's our obligation in this community to look at the traditions that we've inherited. You know, yesterday, Saturday, I spoke to people connected with the Photo League. You know, they were dissolved in 1951 because of McCarthyism. You know, these were the progressive photographers of the time from 1936 to 51. You know, Eugene Smith and you know, Walter Rosenblum, all kinds of people doing important work. They face a lot of what we face, but they got together as a group. And I think we, you know, in our different organizations need to get together and take certain stands and decide what's important and how to fight for it and to support each other. I mean, that's a simple thing. I think, Brian, to answer it more explicitly, I could do my 7 minutes left and then we could go back to the conversation at this point. Does that make sense? Sorry for being hurried, but these things are hurried. So this is where we were. These are just 3 ideas for helping to ensure photographic credibility. One is a just super simple idea. If you think of a photograph as a quotation from appearances, the frame of the photograph is like quote marks. We know in words, if you change a quotation, you have to indicate it. You can't just make up the words. If it's you're quoting somebody or a document, you have to put an ellipsis or in brackets if you're adding a word. So why don't we just decide that a photograph is a quotation from appearances with only minor changes possible, you know, cropping and so on, but that's it. And if we're making any change beyond that, we have to tell the reader. That's one basic idea there. So for example, when the most important issue that Life magazine did in 1969 about the Vietnam War, not the battle photographs, it was simply the soldiers who died that week, over 200 of them, with their name, their age, where they came from, their rank. They were everybody's next door neighbor, brother, son, husband, and so on. And this is the issue where Life magazine was considered to go against the war, not the battle scenes. Again, why aren't we doing this with federal workers? These are the people fired this week or today. These are the veterans who no longer are getting medical care. These are the veterans who lost their jobs at the VA. Why aren't we establishing kind of a straightforward photograph contextualized that we can stand behind the way it was done. So I think some of the answers to the dilemma are things we've already done previously. This is something that Associated Press did. These were veterans who during COVID, around 60 died in a nursing home in Massachusetts. So what the decision here was, David Goldman, AP, to take the photograph of them when they served. They were now, much older when they died, and project it onto the homes of their family members and interview the family members about who the person was in their life. And it was a way of honoring them. So this was done, 2020, 5 years ago during COVID. Why aren't we thinking of things, of dozens and dozens and dozens of strategies to resist the kind of, autocracy that we're facing, in which things are distorted? And why, with images that are heavily manipulated, don't we put an icon on it like not a lens? This is not an actual photograph. This is heavily manipulated. Or this is AI. This is a concentration camp survivor that I made using AI. AI, be very clear about it and just tell the viewer, this is what it is. Just be transparent as if it's a food label. This is organic, this is not, this has sugar, this doesn't. Do it. And then, Brian and I are co-founders of the Writing with Light campaign, which is www.light.org, which is taking the idea that the photographer is the author of the image. Don't depend on the camera, depend on the photographer, just like you depend on a writer. The words in and of themselves are not true or false. The image is not in and of itself true or false. But can I depend on Brian Palmer, the photographer? Yes, I can. And Brian and I and Mickey Ostreicher together came up with the definition, nonfiction photography, because we noticed that you go to a bookstore, you ask for fiction, nonfiction books, it's fine, but we didn't have a concept of what a nonfiction photograph is. So we wrote one. After a century and a half of photography, documentary photography can be personal, it can be conceptual, it can be a restaging, but we wanted to be clear what it is. I'm a nonfiction photographer. Okay, that's what I am. And then this is our statement of principles. All of this is online. You could read it there. You could join the campaign. It's now 2 years old exactly since we started this. So feel free to join. So the third is allow for more context. A photograph is taken in a fractional second. When I was co-curator of a Magnum History of the World, 40 years, it was 400 photographs. I realized that 400 photographs only represented about 4 seconds of history if each image was made in about 100th of a second. So we have to be modest about what a photograph is, and then we have to add context. So the Four Corners Project is a open source software that I suggested going back to 2004, a World Press Photo keynote speech. This is how it works. When it's online, each of the corners has different information embedded in it. On the right, the photographer's caption and credit, and their code of ethics, which you could write in a sentence. What is my code of ethics? A backstory, related imagery, and links, so that this is the photograph. The bottom right corner would hide this information. And here's the code of ethics, which I wrote for the photographer. While all photography is interpretive, as a photojournalist, my photographs are meant to respect the visible facts of the situations I depict. I do not add or subtract elements to or from my photographs. I think at this point, every photographer needs a code of ethics. What do you do and not do? This is the backstory. This is quoting the photographer who'd seen quite a few, unfortunately, bodies washed up on shore, and how this one was different and how it gave her nightmares. It becomes personal, it's authentic. This is the photographer responding. It's not the camera making the picture, it's a human being making the picture. And this is the related imagery. So this is Alan Kurdi and his brother, both who drowned as children, playing together. not just a generic image of his death. Why can't we use that? Online, you could do this. On paper, you couldn't. The digital revolution allows these things to happen. Or on the upper right, links like Human Rights Watch, why it's okay to share the image of a dead child, which normally they would not. You could link to your own homepage. This is how it works. So the codes of ethics, I wrote all of these very quickly. A fashion photographer, I do not photograph underweight models. A fine art photographer, I do alter my images. I'm a fine art photographer. UNICEF, Donna DeCesare, who's here, I do not show the faces of children who are HIV positive who have been child soldiers. Donna's worked a lot with that concept, and so on. So just write a short code of ethics. We need it at this point. So this was the US invasion of Haiti in 1994 to bring a democracy, Aristide, but with the related imagery, this is what it looked like. So why can't we give up these staged events, these opportunities, and be transparent with the reader and don't pretend things happen that didn't happen, to making it look spontaneous. We can share these things. Again, this is how it works. So this is a campaign, If They Gun Me Down, young African-American men and women feeling that if they were killed by the police in the United States, the media would publish the so-called quote unquote gangster image. So here's the backstory. And again, the related imagery, this is the same man. So you can't, everybody's multiple perspectives on who somebody is. So you could represent yourself, you could represent communities in different ways, not just in one way. So these are, three ideas about context and recording, quotation from appearances, and authorship that might be helpful. And just to end with Hannah Arendt, and this is where I think we are. If you can't decide between true and false, that's where you get dictatorship and autocrats. And that's exactly where we are. So this is just a fun image I saw last week. And again, Baldwin, the place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. I think that's the challenge to this community. We have to make a place where we fit, a place with ethics, a place with transparency, a place with context, and most important, a place with authenticity that can provoke a societal conversation and can resist fascism at this point. And this is, Brian and I just IDing. We both have Substack things now to continue the conversation. This is the book, and this is thank you very much. And that's it.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Fred.
I think, Ed, you're going to moderate, get those questions kick in.
We don't actually have questions in the chat, but we can open it up to the people who are here. You could unmute, and if you have a question for Fred or Brian.
I see Nicole.
Hi. Oh my God, what an incredible talk. Thank you both so much. And Fred, I'm so excited to read the book. I I just wanted to give a good quick preface that I actually worked in tech and I worked with a lot of photography. I actually worked at Meta doing a lot of the generated AI imagery for when it created kind of like that photographic when it started to kind of produce photographic imagery. And it's very interesting to me because I actually graduated at NYU and a lot of my work is trying to understand the future of photography by being in these spaces and understanding it. I also worked at AMI during 2016, seeing basically the fall of the media when, Trump got elected and actually being at the newsroom when that happened. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is also very regarded to exactly this, which is like, how do we have the conversation and build community? Using also that there is such a kind of diverse perspective between photographers and folks who actually use AI. I call them like, photographic image makers, through the AI lens. And I am curious to hear if there has been any, um, I don't know, best resources that have been talking about it in a way that you feel like it's promising, or do you still really feel like, because to me, what I feel is that the conversation is very broken. It feels like it is very much a conversation that is not comfortable to be had with photographers, especially photojournalists, to be like understanding the AI is critical to kind of move forward and understand how to actually use AI to create almost codes of ethics with it. So I'm curious to hear if there is any resources or any kind of collectives that you have seen so far that's actually doing that effectively. And if not, I think it's very like it's a very critical space where I'm also trying to push. I do a lot of like, community outreach, especially for underrepresented, marginalized communities. And so it is still like, an impact of literacy as a whole, but literacy now not only in visual, but now with like AI. So curious to hear
Well, I
more.
would just really quickly, because I know Fred will want to say something about this, but um, I'm committed to the empirical. I'm committed to the world that we live in, and I'm a journalist. So I am not going to be involved in fictionalizing or illustrating things, because again, the camera has been used in the analog age to misrepresent people. Like, you didn't need to screw around in the darkroom to make colonized people look like colonized people. So I'm in the world, I'm dealing with the indexical ability of the camera. And as Fred says, so what did he say? We have to be modest about what a photograph can do. So for me, generative AI has no place in journalism, photojournalism, in the production of things that I do. I don't see how you can be committed to facts and introduce that into that process unless you're calling it what it is, a photo illustration.
Thank
I mean, I'm very disappointed, Nicole, just to answer, my sense is that I agree with you, it's completely fragmented at this point. There's certain people here with whom, I exchange emails all the time about, did you read this? Did you look at this? What do you think of that? And so on. And everybody is aghast and upset, but it's fragmented. We don't join a community. So with Writing with Light, which is National Press Photographers, we originally had World Press Photo, but they pulled out. We have Magnum Photos, Larry Towles representing them, and so on. We've tried to do conferences involve editors, picture editors and so on. And we have real trouble getting anybody to show up to talk. And sometimes, when I've talked to photographers, that it's kind of, we're all in a bubble, that photography is reactive. Something happens, you make a picture, but you don't think about it very much. The impact of the picture, you're not critical about it. Again, going back to the Trump, with the finger raised, personally, I hate that image. I really find that we in this community should be critical. We should not be selling publications based upon, a worldwide wrestling stunt. We should be doing more. So it's not just blaming the AI, it's blaming ourselves and asking ourselves, why don't we call each other out? That may win the Pulitzer Prize, that. But I think it's a distortion of what we're about in doing it. So, I mean, just to put it in, Robert Capa could probably win the World Press Photo Award this year if he was alive. And there's no other, you couldn't do that in cinema, you could not do that in literature, you can't do that in poetry, you can't do that in painting. But in photography, we have so little intellectual discourse, especially in journalistic documentary, asking these questions and holding ourselves to standards, that we just get away with the idea, the camera never lies, a picture's worth 1,000 words, all that stuff that lingers. And we all know it lies all the time. We all know it's not worth 1,000 words. We all know that, but we're unwilling to move it forward in a way, and we're unwilling to form a community to do it. We're looking at this point for leadership. It's just like Columbia University just crashed. Paul Weiss just crashed. There's no leadership. And our community, we need organizations and individuals to be leaders and stand up and say, we are not going to just be products of algorithms. We're not just going to make pictures that sell the most issues. We're going to be critical. We're going to be thoughtful, because human beings, the planet is at stake. It's much bigger than making $1 billion. It's much more important. So I find it, at this point, very, very fragmented. I'm giving 3 talks in 5 days this week. Each group doesn't know the other group, and it just keeps going that way. That's it. I wish I could be more, like, wow, we're really doing the right thing, but I don't think we are.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Fred, can I ask one question here?
Sure.
Wonderful talk. Just one question here. We are all photographers here. These developments are not driven by us. They are driven by tech companies. And there was a scary moment at the inauguration of Donald Trump when all these tech bros like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook were appearing on the stage. How do you see that we can bridge this gap between photography and technology? Because I know, because I'm active on the other side of the tech aisle, and there I know that there is a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of how wonderful, how revolutionary this technology is. How do you think we can bridge this gap between, there is some residual of ethics in journalism, but there seems to be no ethics in technology left. How do you see we can bridge that and work with that? Because here we are photographers. There is barely a technology people here.
I don't agree with you. I really, there's an argument that we're photographers, therefore we don't have power. It's somebody else's fault. But I think we all have power. It's like if I had a child and suddenly they change the baby food, what's in it, I would be out on the streets protesting, and I'm just a parent. Or if and down the line, the stuff is happening in Gaza, and you have students being arrested and being deported, and they have no power. And many of them are first generation going to college, and they're standing up for it. I see no reason that photographers with your many organizations should not be standing up and saying, we will not go along with this anymore, that we believe in something deeper than making $1 billion. And, we supported Adobe for 40 years or whatever it is, buying your products. We expect more of you. I spoke to a very high-ranking engineer in one of the top tech companies. He said to me, I don't think my grandchildren are going to believe the images of me when they grow up. And he's worried about it. But I don't see any resistance from our community. The way you saw, for example, with Black Lives Matter, people are on the street. They lost a lot. People had something to lose. In Europe, for example, in Paris, at one point, all the photographers put their cameras down in front of City Hall. And they said, we're not going to work under these conditions. Giovanni's here, who works in Paris. And to me, I was really impressed with the photograph of all the cameras being placed on the sidewalk and people saying, we will not work anymore. So, Julia is saying in the chat, same thing in Buenos Aires. Why are we doing so little in this community? We're not honoring the people who came before us. We talk about Louis Hine, about Margaret Bourke-White, about Dorothea Lange, Gordon Parks, but we're not part of that tradition if we allow this stuff to happen. We have to honor that tradition, and we have to speak up and do it. Our publication should be filled with petitions. Thousands of photographers saying we won't put up with it, but we're not doing it.
Could I just ask something? What would
Sure.
what comes to my mind? What would Susan Sontag say about this development? she was always a little, critical of photography as a medium.
Yeah, but she was. I think the difference is that Susan Sontag was very critical of it, but I think what we're trying to do today is be both critical of it and come up with a constructive response. It's not just the criticism. We all know it has all kinds of flaws and problems, and it can be very colonial. When Brian and I, Brian deserves enormous credit for copy editing my book in an incredibly smart way. And we talked about digital colonialism, the people using AI and making, people, from the global South, turning them into what we want them to be. They could be very racist, misogynist, and so on. What do we do about these things? So I think Sontag would be very critical, but I think what we're looking for here is not just the criticism, we're looking for the response. And again, looking at who's here, we have a lot of industry leaders. And, in my opinion, there's a lot of power in this industry. It's not simply just to, go along with the empire. We have to do things differently.
Fred, there's a question from Robin, if she wants to speak up.
Can you please turn your camera on, Robin?
Camera on.
Yes.
Thank you.
So it seems like there's a different code of ethics for writers, for songwriters, for screen actors. I mean, the Screen Actors Guild was protesting the possible use of AI with regard to their voices in any kind of media. It seems like songwriters are constantly suing each other for tunes that sound familiar to songs that were written 50 years ago. Or I mean there are just constantly lawsuits regarding songwriters and writers, fiction writers, fiction versus nonfiction writers, just people, appropriation and AI. It seems like, but photography is always seemed to be an open, just open for anyone to steal your images and manipulate them and possibly make AI images out of them. I mean, it's there is, it just seems like there's way different codes of ethics for different art forms.
I think it's a really good point, and I think it also opens up the thing that a number of stock agencies, Shutterstock, Getty, and so on, there's a lot of money to be made in licensing photographs to AI companies to learn from. And, I think it was Shutterstock was talking about a $250 million forecast of profit. And then, the people get paid per photograph. And I think it was like 2 cents or 3 cents or something like that per photograph for the licensing. So a lot of this is being used as raw material simply to train AI, which is going to put photographers out of business. So I think that's one place where photographers, some have complained, is the issue of intellectual property, but the other issue of the ethics and credible witnessing and so on, there's been very little discussion. So Robin, I agree with you. It's the Hollywood strikes and so on and so forth, the writers' strikes, actors' strikes, they've banded together for their collective future, and photographers, for the most part, have not done that. I agree with that.
We have a question from Ronit. She has her hand raised.
Can you speak, Ronit? Maybe she doesn't hear us. Edward, can you read Mariana's question, please?
Yes. Here's a question. Wondering out loud if something like simply adding a label of not AI to any images we publish would begin to differentiate or make a point.
The problem there is that it increases skepticism. You know, the assumption is like you go to a grocery store and you pick up a banana and it says not rotten. And then you say, should I really be buying this banana? You know, it's and then it leaves out the computational, because you don't want something that's heavily, you know, Photoshop to be thought of as the same as unretouched photograph. It's not just AI, it's across the board. And again, I just go back to, if it's just a recording of the visible, quotation from appearances, you know, to me, that's what a photograph would be. And then other forms, we'd have to indicate what they are. In a journalistic documentary approach, if you're an artist, you do what you want, you know, in a gallery. But in terms of the witnessing issue, that's where the problem is. But yes, any of these ideas we should be discussing. And again, I don't know why for the last 2-3 years there haven't been, like, you know, meetings of top editors, you know, top photographers, top agents, and so on, and just asking, how do we deal with this? You know, we do need labeling systems. Yes.
Ronit, are you, is it working?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So yeah, I have a podcast called The Grain where I interview creatives about AI and the future of creativity. And it's all about kind of the good and the bad, the pleasure and the peril. And that duality is something, as you know, a photo historian myself, someone who's worked in photography and magazines for 2 decades, the duality that exists in photography is inherent throughout its entire evolution, ever since Anna Atkins' Pencil of Nature in 1844 depicted botanical images as both artful bouquets and beautiful arrangements, but also scientific studies of what those plants and flora were. And to me, I see that maybe photojournalism was kind of a blip in the evolution of photography. And not to sound nihilistic, but it might be that AI has kind of shone a mirror, so to speak, at photography and said, well, this duality of AI, of photography, as being a kind of shapeshifter and having this dual nature of being true and false, it's all coming home to roost. And I wonder what your thoughts are on, can photography define itself against AI, or is AI just kind of showing us what this inherent quality always has been for photography?
I think it's been inherent, but I think we're ignoring first the subject and then the utility of so-called straight images. Yes, they've always been interpretive, as Fred points out, but they've also been considered evidence. And that's what some of us are interested in producing. You know, there's fiction, and fiction moves people, and there's nonfiction, and that has its purpose. And I understand that some documentarians do recreations and so on and so forth, but they're upfront about that. I think if you look at it from a subject's point of view as well, if there's a photographer who has integrity, like say a Donna de Cesare, who's photographing them in their situation, we know Donna has integrity. She puts the images out in the world, and we trust Donna, as Fred was saying, and we trust her images. There's still utility. There's still a powerful use for that. Nicole, I think AI can do a lot of things. Fred has given us great examples of the conceptual things that AI can do. One great example you have, Fred, is using a generative AI to visualize the impact of climate change 50 years from now. But I've been photographing in the same African-American historic cemetery for years, and the facts on the ground there matter. What the headstones say exactly matters. The condition of the cemetery matters exactly. So that's what I'm doing, and I still see that it has value, because because AI is not existing, at least as that I know it, in our world where we bleed, die, love, live, right? It can't do that. So what I do is my my interpretation, my quotation of that to me absolutely matters. So yes, I think that there should be some flexibility in how we consider AI, but in my practice and in the practices of others, I think it's important for us to say we don't do that. So you can rely on our images and you can rely on us. That's it. I tell my journalism students, all we have without the camera, without the pen, without the computer is our integrity. That's all we have. And my integrity is invested in the indexical relationship between scene and photo. That still matters to me.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Brian. In fact, I was going to say some of the same things. Photography is not true. It's never been the truth. So I'm not worried about disproving it because it's never been true. We know that. It's a recording of the visible. That's what it is in a documentary way. And going back to what Brian's saying, if somebody is getting, bombed in a war zone or suffering from a disease, I don't want us, saying, well, can we believe the image, not believe the image? There are people's lives at stake. I've worked enough in human rights and journalism and so on. There are a lot of people running around healthy now because of what photography has been able to do for them. So if we're giving that up, to me, it's a kind of response of affluent communities to the rest of the world who are basically then don't have to worry about the rest of the world because the photograph itself might be quote unquote untrue. So those people don't exist, their peril doesn't exist, the massacres don't exist, the bombings don't exist because we could disprove, the photograph may be disprovable. So what we're doing is building a bubble around ourselves and cutting off the rest of the world, by that kind of an approach. So I think that the issue of it's not ever true, but it is an interpretation. It's human, photographer using it of stuff that is going on, and then we need to respond to. And I think that's what we've been doing for the last several decades. It's in consumer entitlement, you get what you want. So now we have, AI generated backgrounds, that are being pushed with all these cameras. If you don't like the reality the way it is, we'll make it something else. The first book I wrote was In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography, 1990. We want the world to look like what we want it to look like. And that way we exclude the pain and the suffering, going back to the Susan Sontag question. We exclude that. And I think what we're looking at now is how do we include the rest of the world, in terms of images that cannot be just rejected because maybe there's somehow something wrong, corrupted somehow with it. So that's it. So, words, there's poetry, but there's also nonfiction reporting. In photography, there's art photography, and there's also nonfiction reporting. And that's what we're talking about here. The world, the rest of the world, all of us.
Giovanni has his hand up, if you'd like to ask. And unmute yourself, please.
Giovanni, you're muted. And then Anne, you'll be next.
Okay.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. First, I had two small questions. The first one is just to know if there is a union of photographers in United States, because in France there is several photo rights, imagery rights unions and photography union. So I don't know if United States that thing exists. And the second one is photography still has some power, fortunately enough, as Israel forbids photojournalists and journalists to get into Gaza. And I guess because they believe that we will not trust the Palestinian journalists as we would trust the foreign journalists. That's all.
I think the answer to the first one is we have National Press Photographers Association, we have ASMP, there's different groups representing photographers in different ways, but there's no, concerted union the way there is, as Robin pointed out, in Hollywood for these Screen Actors Guild or, actors and so on and so forth. There's no, collective bargaining. There's, nothing of that nature in this country here. And since there are fewer and fewer staff photographers in publications, and it's more and more freelance, it becomes even more vulnerable and fragile here. I think in terms of Israel and Gaza, yeah, it's like the U.S. and the Iraq War excluded the photographers as well. But I think what we're finding is that less and less is that going to be necessary because of the image credibility itself. I was arguing on Saturday that with the Photo League, that you had to threaten the actual photographers, as quote unquote communists during McCarthyism in the 40s and 50s, and now the currency of the image is so devalued that the image itself doesn't have the power to resist the way it used to have. Yes, it's more convenient for the Israeli government to keep the international photographers out of Gaza for sure, but it's becoming less and less necessary, is my unfortunate conclusion. On the other hand, if you look at Gaza, some of the Gaza photographers have larger followers than major publications do, over 1 million people following them. So there's, other ways of figuring it out. So one sequel to what you're asking is, I think a lot of the photographic awards at this point, World Press Photo and elsewhere, should be going to people working on social media who do not work in conventional publications. Because in fact, take Gaza, they're having more impact on the world in many cases than the conventional media themselves are. They're showing much more explicitly what's going on, much more in first person, much more authentic, much more believable. And I think we have to start incorporating social media into many of our, what we recognize as being important. We have to get over this point of just, talking about conventional media as somehow the hierarchy that's the most important. Social media in many ways is more important at this point.
There's a question in the chat from Carolina asking, would a virtual photography summit or gathering to organize individual and organizations' goals and actions and getting a cross-section of folks move this organizing forward?
100% yes, definitely. Worldwide, definitely, including people from, like Nicole is pointing out, people with AI backgrounds or tech backgrounds. There's some very, very smart people all over the place. Programmers should be part of it, designers should be part of it, editors, writers, filmmakers, and so on. Yeah, but for sure, there should be these kinds of meetings and discussing, what are the best practices, and just a question, for example, should a photographer include their code of ethics? Where you could click on their name and see what their code of ethics is. Is that a good idea? There's lots of things that can be changed and maybe need to be changed at this point. But we have to be much more innovative and push it and try out these new ideas. I think we're long overdue for such a conference, whether it's virtual or physical, for sure.
I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we have to wrap it up. And you have had your hand up for a very long time. Do you still want to ask your question?
Yes, I would like still to ask my question. I'm a New York-based freelance photographer. I've been working with immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees for 10 years, mostly at a community level. And in the past years, especially in the past year, given the witch hunt going on and a program of mass deportation, I've been more and more concerned about how my images published, say, in social media, especially on the sites of some local organizations that may have some social media clout, they may be used to identify and be detrimental to the safety of people even who recently got their green cards. So my question is not about generative AI, it's about images being used by police state using AI technology. And I've been trying to do some research. I know that Johns Hopkins is working on some issues of privacy for refugees, and Cambridge University as well. I've been trying to be in touch, but I was wondering if you had any comment about what could be a proper code of ethic of a community-based photographer like me at the beginning of a process where images may be used against the people, represented people.
To me, it's a Hippocratic oath, the same that doctors use, you know, that you cannot incur pain on the people you're supposed to be helpful to. And so, you know, I'm teaching a class right now at the ICP. We're working similarly on deportation and immigration. And the number one rule is that we don't want to be part of identifying people who then get in trouble because of us at this point. So I think it's a case by case. If it's used locally, you know, in a community hall for the community, you know, that community, sometimes you could do things differently. It's also issues of permission too. You know, I've been working with the UN, you know, asking young people, do you want to be identified or not? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think you're right. There's also work in software so that it makes it harder for the AI to just, you know, to identify published images of people. But it is a different world where we have to think about those things much more than we thought about it before. You know, you can't just think you're doing the right thing and end up, you know, harming the people you're trying to help. It's a different world at this point.
Yeah. It's also generational, because I remember just a few years ago, young people at a particular protest here in Richmond were saying, don't photograph me, don't photograph me. And of course, my response is, damn it, you're out in public. You know, this is a public activity. Don't you remember the civil rights movement? Doxing and all that stuff is real now. So I have to think about that as well. And I think, as Fred said, it's a case by case kind of thing. You know, I look to, once again, Donna, I see you with your class. I looked at Donna's photography of HIV positive kids and child soldiers as a way to deal with that issue. Be creative without faces.
There's a comment from Julia Pontes saying disabling geolocation on your camera is important too. And I think the last question from the chat is from Felix. When it comes to journalism, can we expect some sort of standard regarding integrity from major news outlets, similarly as they do to verify news stories and use real-time fact-checking?
I think the short answer is no, because there's too much money in AI and in photo illustration, and I think there's too much potential profit in mixing those media. That's my feeling, but I would love for that to happen.
I think you're seeing more New York Times, Washington Post, forensic architecture, different groups of people, you know, using GPS, different technologies to confirm that pictures were made where they're supposed to have been made, and so on. You know, that was supposed to be a distinguishing frontier between social media and conventional media. That conventional media does the fact checking, it confirms stuff, it just doesn't publish anything. But to me, that's not as convincing as it used to be, because I'm finding that conventional media is more and more using generic imagery. You know, it'll say there's a problem with the police, and you'll see a picture of a police car, or you'll see, you know, they're not doing the investigation. They're not going beneath the surface at this point. Part of it is a 24/7 news cycle. You know, part of it is a lot of places don't have picture editors anymore, or they're looking at too many images simultaneously to make sense of it. And something else to remember is that when we had print media, there was a coherence. If you were doing a photo essay, 6 pages, 8 pages, you could sequence the photographs. You chose the scale of the photographs, what's big, what's small, which image is juxtaposed with another image, what's the headline, what's the typography. You had a lot of control of building something, a statement that was bigger than a single image on Instagram. And we lost most of that. We have a big photo book industry right now, but very few people see it. So I think one of the issues, we're seeing, for example, Disturb, a Paris, New York-based group that brings photographs and puts them on walls in different cities. They use barcodes so that people sometimes hear the photographer's voice talking about it. There has to be other ways in getting the imagery out and keeping control of it, contextualizing it, sequencing it, doing it, making projections at public gatherings, different ways of using it that are innovative and push it in ways that are a lot more than just here's a whole bunch of images, sort of an idea. So that's part of it as well. So, what I would do, and, going back to Reni's question before, I think what AI brings to us is a sense that it's a moment of reflection. If AI could simulate photographs in such a realistic way, what does it say about photography? And then respond to that by saying, how do we innovate? How do we reinvent? How do we recreate the photograph so it's as vital and authentic and credible as it possibly can be today? And what are those experiments, and also sharing them with each other. One really important issue is that the important work at this point is not controlled in Europe and North America. It's all over the world. There's extraordinary work being done everywhere by photographers locally, nationally, internationally, who are very sophisticated, very innovative, very thoughtful, and we should be sharing those kinds of projects, what are successes, problems, and so on, throughout, and not pretending, as we did in the 20th century, to have a sort of semi-monopoly in the North over some of these issues. That's, far from true. It never was true, but right now it's certainly not true. So that's another reason, to go back to that virtual conference, to include people from everywhere discussing how do we move forward. There's a lot at stake. It's really not about photography, it's about the world at this point. And, I think it's all of us have to move it forward. Again, just, I know we're concluding because we always run out of time, but the issue, this is just an introduction. It's a provocation. These are issues and ideas. None of us have all the answers, but all of us have to think of what the answers might be, share it, and try to move us ahead. I think that's the point of this. We have to do it urgently, because as we see, governments collapse quickly, societies fall apart, and we have to, evidence a sense of resistance and use all the smart people together to try to figure out a way forward. I hope that makes sense. Brian, do you want to conclude with something?
Nope, I think I've said my piece, and thank you for that, Fred. It kind of wraps us up pretty well.
So,
Wonderful.
again, thank you to Anya, to Edward, to
Yes,
all
thank
you
you.
guys, and let's see how we can move it forward.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to hold up the book. Get the book. I put the link in the chat, and also the emails that we sent you also has a link to
Yeah.
where you can purchase the book. So
Super. Thank you for hosting, Anya and Ed.
Yeah, and just
You are
last thing, stay tuned. We'll probably have follow-up conversations, trying to implement stuff and make it more concrete. So this is kind of an introductory, sense of some of the environment in which we are right now, and then we'll try to move it forward. Okay, so thanks to everybody, and thanks to Brian.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank
you,
you.
Brian. Thank you, Edward. Thank you all for being here. And let's stay in touch for more talks like this.